Hey strangers, thanks for stopping by and spending your time with us. Before we start, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? We love seeing how far these stories travel. And if you enjoy it, don't forget to subscribe. It means a lot. Now, let's begin.
Chapter 1. Shadows on the Threshold. The first time I stepped into the apartment, it felt as though the walls were holding their breath. The door creaked in a way that seemed almost deliberate, like it was warning me that the space beyond wasn't entirely empty. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows, casting long, hesitant rectangles of light across the dust-laden floor. Each speck in the air seemed to hang in place, suspended for a moment before drifting into the shadows. There was an odd stillness, a sense of waiting that made me want to pull back, to leave the keys on the counter and walk away. The landlord, Mr. Caldwell, met me at the door. A thin man in his 60s with an unnervingly precise haircut. He looked like he had memorized every wrinkle and crease of his own face. His hands trembled slightly as he handed me the keys, and his voice had that brittle edge of someone unaccustomed to lies. "Welcome," he said, and for a moment his gaze lingered on me in a way that felt almost too searching. "Before you settle in, there's something you should know about the previous tenant." I raised an eyebrow, trying to read his expression. "Oh, what kind of something?" He hesitated, swallowing hard, and then pressed a folded piece of paper into my palm. The edges were frayed, the paper yellowed with age, and the ink looked freshly preserved despite the wear. "It's a list," he said, his voice lowering almost to a whisper. "A list of names. The tenant left it behind. You should be careful. There's history here." I unfolded the paper with cautious curiosity. The handwriting was neat, almost meticulous, each letter precise, as if the writer had been trying to preserve order in a world that was slowly unraveling. One by one, my eyes scanned the names, and then my stomach tightened. Each one was familiar in a way that unsettled me, not because I knew them personally, but because a quick search on my phone later confirmed what I had feared. They had vanished. Each one disappeared in the past few years. No notes, no sightings, no online trace. Just gone. And the tenant who left this list? Gone as well. A shiver ran down my spine. Most people would have walked away then, abandoned the apartment, the keys, and the paper. But I didn't. I couldn't. There was a curiosity gnawing at me, insistent, irresistible. It whispered, "Look closer, see what everyone else missed." I spent the first night unpacking half-heartedly, my thoughts constantly returning to the list. The apartment itself seemed almost to conspire with my curiosity. A crooked painting on the wall, the faint smell of varnish mixing with old paper, the way the radiator clanged intermittently as if punctuating my unease. It all felt like a subtle invitation to dig deeper. I couldn't stop myself from studying the list. The handwriting was almost hypnotic. The names seemed to form a rhythm in my mind, each one like a heartbeat in an empty room. I wondered if the previous tenant had left the list as a warning, a message, or something more cryptic, maybe a trail of breadcrumbs. The apartment itself began to reveal small, odd details. A single coffee mug in the sink, clean but out of place. A folded newspaper tucked under a couch cushion, dated months ago, but seemingly untouched. A faint scuff on the wooden floor near the bedroom door, as if someone had been dragged or had dragged something across it. None of it violent, none of it overtly sinister, but enough to make the hair on my arms rise. I tried calling Mr. Caldwell again, asking about the previous tenant, but he was evasive. "People move on," he said, though his voice carried an edge of unease. "Sometimes they move on differently than expected." He didn't elaborate, and I wasn't sure if he knew or if he simply refused to tell. By the end of the night, I pinned the list to the corkboard above my desk. I lit a single lamp and stared at it for hours, as if by focusing I could will some sense out of the tangled web of names. Each one seemed to vibrate slightly, like a signal I couldn't fully interpret. I felt simultaneously connected to them and completely removed, like a voyeur looking through a window into lives that had abruptly ended. Sleep came fitfully. In my dreams, the apartment shifted, rooms folding into each other, doors opening into emptiness, and whispers brushing past my ears, voices that weren't there when I woke. I dreamed of faces I couldn't place, faces that might belong to the names on the list. I woke more than once convinced I heard a footstep or a soft tap on the door, only to find the apartment as silent and empty as it had been before. By morning, my curiosity had grown into a gnawing obsession. I couldn't leave the apartment. I couldn't stop thinking about the previous tenant, about the names on the list, about the way the light fell and shadows moved. It was as if the apartment had absorbed the disappearances of the past, and now it wanted me to notice, to follow the faint trail left behind. And in the deepest corner of my mind, a single question began to pulse, urgent and relentless. If someone had vanished here before, what would stop it from happening again? I had arrived with the expectation of a fresh start. Instead, I had stepped into a mystery. And whatever game had begun, I knew with a cold certainty that the first move had already been made. Chapter 2. First Threads in the Dark. The morning after my first night in the apartment, I felt an urgency that made it impossible to linger over breakfast or unpack in peace. The list of names, now pinned above my desk like a morbid constellation, was calling me. I needed to know, needed to start connecting dots that, until then, existed only as cold, lonely points on a page. I began with what felt safest, the internet. Each name I typed into search engines, social media, public records, and missing persons databases produced the same unsettling result: silence. Sparse news clippings here, a vague social media post years old there, but no one reporting a disappearance that connected them. It was as if these people had evaporated from existence one by one, leaving only their names and the faint trace of memory. Yet, even in this silence, I started to notice patterns. A few of the names shared neighborhoods, occupations, or even schools. At first, it seemed like coincidence, but the more I dug, the more subtle similarities emerged. Some had last been seen on particular days of the week. Others had connections to the same small network of companies or social groups. Nothing concrete, nothing undeniable, but enough to make me lean closer to the screen, my heart thudding in quiet anticipation. It was when I began talking to neighbors that the first real threads appeared. I started with casual conversations. Mrs. Hawthorne from 3B, who had lived in the building longer than anyone else. A man from the floor above, an off-duty police officer who treated casual chats with a practiced politeness that suggested he was used to people probing into things better left alone. "Previous tenant?" Mrs. Hawthorne said, peering over her glasses. "Oh, you mean the quiet one. Never saw much of him. Kept to himself mostly." "Did he leave anything behind?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Anything at all?" She hesitated, her knitting needles pausing mid-air. "There was a list, I think. Something about people he knew. Didn't make much sense. Never asked him about it. Folks like that you don't pry too much into. Strange things tend to follow." Her words sent a shiver down my spine. Strange things. Already, even neighbors had a sense of unease, a weight I hadn't yet understood. I visited the small cafe across the street, hoping to find someone who might have seen one of the missing people or at least heard rumors. Conversations were polite but unhelpful, the kind of vague deflections people offer when they sense a dangerous curiosity. Still, I did not give up. One barista, a young man with nervous energy, mentioned he remembered seeing a woman from one of the names walking with a man he didn't recognize. They seemed careful, like they didn't want to be noticed, he said, shrugging. It was almost nothing, but in that nothing I felt a pulse of significance. Back at the apartment, I began to map everything. I drew circles around names, linked them with lines that denoted possible relationships or coincidences. Every subtle detail from my internet searches or conversations became a tiny thread. The more I mapped, the more the web grew dense, intricate, almost alive. It wasn't long before I started noticing small, inexplicable coincidences in the apartment itself. A book left open on the coffee table to a page about missing persons. A photograph tucked in the back of a drawer showing a gathering of people whose faces were eerily familiar, faces I would later realize were on the list. The apartment seemed to be leaving me breadcrumbs, yet whether intentionally or by accident, I could not tell. And then there was the sound, not loud, not obvious, but a soft, almost rhythmic tapping. Sometimes it was the radiator, sometimes I couldn't locate it at all. It wasn't threatening, but it was persistent, a subtle reminder that I wasn't entirely alone, or at least that the apartment had memories. By the end of the week, I had begun a small ritual. Every morning, I would check the list, revisit my notes, and update the connections. Every evening, I would walk the streets near the neighborhoods where some of the missing had last been seen, pretending it was a casual stroll, but always with my ears and eyes tuned for anomalies. I started noticing the same faces watching from a distance, people who seemed slightly out of place, their attention too focused. I couldn't be sure, but my mind began to whisper possibilities. A breakthrough, or what felt like one, came unexpectedly. While examining an old public record, I found a subtle overlap in employment dates and addresses. Two of the names, who had supposedly never met, had in fact worked for the same small consulting firm at the same time. It was such a small coincidence, barely worth noting, but in the context of everything else, it felt like a thread I could pull. Driven by this, I sought out former colleagues, cold calls, awkward encounters, partial recollections. People remembered someone vaguely resembling the previous tenant, visiting certain offices, asking questions about individuals who later disappeared. No one could confirm anything definitively, but patterns were emerging in the gaps of their memories, the things left unsaid, the pauses before a reply. I found myself obsessing. Every detail mattered. Every half-remembered story, every faded photograph, every misplaced object in my apartment became a piece of a puzzle I couldn't stop piecing together. Sleep began to elude me. My dreams populated with rooms filled with the faces of people I might never see again. Every shadow seemed meaningful, every stranger a potential link. By the end of the second week, I had accumulated a growing pile of notes, maps, and photographs. It was exhausting and yet exhilarating. I had begun to see the faint outlines of something larger than coincidence, an invisible thread connecting these disappearances. A pattern I couldn't yet articulate but could feel in the pit of my stomach. And there, at the heart of it all, was the apartment itself, its silence, its dust, its strange little hints. It felt alive, a witness perhaps, or even a participant. I often found myself talking aloud, whispering to the walls, as though asking for answers would somehow coax them out of hiding. It was during one of these nightly sessions, leaning over the cork board with the list in front of me, that I noticed something I had missed before, a sequence of initials that repeated across several names. At first I thought it was a coincidence, but the more I traced them, the more they formed a pattern I could not ignore. And as I stared at the tiny looping letters, a new thought took root, sharper and more insistent than any I had felt before. Perhaps the list wasn't just a record of absence, it was a map pointing towards something, someone, or some truth hidden in plain sight. I didn't know what that truth was yet, but I knew I was already in too deep to stop. Chapter 3. Patterns Emerge. By the time I entered the third week in the apartment, the list of names had become more than a set of absent people. It had become a puzzle I could not set aside. I had taken to filling my apartment with scribbles, maps, and sticky notes connecting neighborhoods, dates, and vague encounters in what felt like an increasingly intricate web. I had begun to see connections that were invisible to others, patterns hiding in plain sight. It started small. At first, just overlapping dates, 2 disappearances occurring on the same day of the week, months or years apart. Then came more subtle coincidences. Several of the missing lived near small parks or community centers, places that seemed innocuous until I realized they all shared the same obscure type of bench, the kind rarely found outside a handful of municipal parks in the city. It was ridiculous, almost laughable, but I couldn't shake the unease it provoked. I created a timeline on my wall, a linear thread running from the earliest disappearance to the most recent. Pins marked addresses, dates, occupations, and locations of last sightings. When I traced my finger along the thread, a curious rhythm emerged, one that suggested intention rather than randomness. Someone, or something, was orchestrating these vanishings with meticulous care. It was during one of my late-night sessions, scribbling yet another line between 2 names, that I noticed a curious anomaly. Several of the people on the list had received unusual communications in the weeks before disappearing. Letters, emails, messages that seemed benign at first glance, but shared a subtle, almost imperceptible structure, a peculiar phrase repeated across multiple correspondences, a sentence fragment that hinted at observation, presence, awareness. I printed copies of each and stared at them for hours. Patterns emerged not just in dates or locations, but in the very behavior of the missing. Most of them had recently changed jobs or relocated, always to places within a narrow geographic corridor. Even their social circles overlapped unexpectedly. I began to hypothesize that someone had been observing them for months, years even, cataloging details others would consider trivial, favorite coffee shops, walking routes, even the slight eccentricities of their schedules. Obsessed, I started taking nightly walks in the neighborhoods these people had last been seen. At first, it was cautious, almost innocent curiosity, but soon every shadow seemed to carry significance. Every passerby, no matter how mundane, became a potential observer, a possible piece of a hidden puzzle. I began recording license plates, noting patterns in pedestrian movement, comparing them against maps and satellite images. Even the apartment seemed to participate in my growing sense of pattern. On the third night, while reviewing old photographs tucked behind a loose floorboard in the bedroom, I noticed something I had missed before. Subtle alignments between objects in the apartment and locations associated with the disappearances. A mug left near the kitchen window, a photograph facing a certain angle on the shelf. Small, insignificant gestures, yet when I laid them against my map wall, they formed lines that converged in an almost deliberate manner. I began to meet more people linked to the missing. Former coworkers, distant friends,
even casual acquaintances. Their recollections were fragmentary, inconsistent, and sometimes contradictory. But in their gaps and hesitations, I found fertile ground for insight. One former colleague mentioned seeing a man matching the previous tenant's description in a local cafe, watching certain individuals intently. Another recalled an odd habit. Several of the missing had received handwritten notes in envelopes, unsigned, always the same small, precise handwriting. The more I pieced together, the more the apartment felt like a conduit rather than a residence. Every detail, every whisper of movement, every subtle anomaly seemed to point toward some larger design. I started recording everything meticulously, building a mental image of a network, a hidden force linking these disappearances. Each revelation increased the tension, the sense that I was on the verge of something immense and terrible. I slept less, wandered more, and pored over the list with a near ritualistic fervor. The web of connections grew so complex that I had to label lines and intersections with multiple colors, each representing a different type of relationship: geographical, occupational, social. Even the colors themselves seemed to carry significance, like a code waiting to be deciphered. One night, a subtle discovery made me sit back and hold my breath. Among the photographs I had pulled from the apartment, a single image depicted a small gathering in a park. At first glance, it seemed random, a picnic perhaps. But one face caught my attention. A figure who occurred in multiple photos I had collected, always observing, never participating. I traced this figure through my notes and realized with a cold clarity that it might be the one constant across all disappearances. It was not conclusive, but it was enough to ignite a new obsession. I began cross-referencing addresses, employment records, and social media posts against the figure in the photographs. The lines of coincidence became denser, forming a lattice of possibility. I felt as if the entire city was a board game, and I had just discovered the pattern hidden beneath the surface, waiting to be played out. Despite the mounting clues, frustration built as well. Some patterns resisted interpretation. Certain names, certain dates seemed to follow logic only to break it moments later. Contradictions emerged, and with each one I felt a creeping anxiety, as if the entire investigation was simultaneously revealing and concealing, like a riddle with half the letters scratched away. By the end of the week, I had compiled a digital map linking every individual location and clue I had uncovered. Lines intersected like veins, dots glimmered like distant stars. I stepped back and stared at it for what felt like hours, the sheer complexity of the web both exhilarating and terrifying. Somewhere within it, I knew lay the explanation, the mechanism of the disappearances, the identity of the orchestrator. I just had to find it. The patterns were emerging, slowly, deliberately, and I could feel myself teetering on the edge of revelation. But alongside that sense of discovery was a darker truth. The deeper I delved, the more I realized the list of names was not merely a record of absence, it was a warning. And if I wasn't careful, I could be next. As I pinned one final note to the wall, connecting yet another seemingly trivial detail to the web, I heard it again. The faint, almost imperceptible tapping. Not from the radiator this time, but from somewhere else, closer. I froze, breath caught, listening. The apartment seemed alive, aware, responsive. I had crossed a threshold, it whispered to me, and now the patterns demanded my attention whether I was ready or not.
I realized, with a chill I could not shake, that the threads were no longer optional to follow. Each detail, each subtle alignment, each minor coincidence was part of a chain that demanded tracing to its conclusion. And as I traced it, I began to wonder if the previous tenant had seen the same web, and if following it had been what led to his disappearance. The list of names was no longer just a record of absence. It was a map of something far larger than I could yet comprehend. And I, standing at the center of the web, felt the invisible eyes watching, waiting to see what I would do next.
Chapter 4: The Apartment Clues. It was on the morning of the third week that I began to notice the apartment itself was offering me something more than subtle hints. It was speaking. At first, I thought it was my imagination, a product of sleepless nights and obsessive note-taking. But the small, almost imperceptible details began to accumulate until they formed a pattern I could not ignore. I was examining a corner of the living room near the window when I noticed a slight discoloration on the carpet, faint but persistent. Kneeling, I traced it with my fingers and felt the edge of something beneath the floorboards. My heart leapt. Carefully, I lifted the loose plank and found a small folded envelope. No markings, no name, just the same precise handwriting that had appeared on the list. Inside was a photograph, a blurred image of a man standing near one of the city parks I had been mapping. I didn't recognize him at first, but something about the posture, the way he held himself, made my stomach knot. This was the first real clue the apartment had given me. It wasn't violent, it wasn't overtly threatening, but it was deliberate. It was a breadcrumb left for someone willing to follow it. Over the next few days, I began to examine the apartment with renewed intensity, inspecting drawers, floorboards, and corners I had previously overlooked. Each item I discovered was small and subtle: a receipt from a distant cafe, a ticket stub with a date corresponding to the disappearance of one of the people on the list, a pressed flower in a book whose species grew only in one small region of the city. None of these objects made sense on their own, but together they hinted at movement, surveillance, and, most unsettlingly, a deliberate record of human behavior. It was as though the previous tenant had left a trail for me to follow, or perhaps for someone else to discover. And in the meticulousness of these hidden objects, I felt a gnawing sense of being watched. Sometimes while examining a clue, I would catch a movement in the corner of my eye, a shadow flickering across the window, a reflection that didn't match the furniture, a sound that could have been nothing. Yet the apartment itself seemed to pulse with an awareness that I could not define. One evening, I found a notebook tucked behind a loose panel in the bedroom closet. The pages were filled with observations, some mundane, some chillingly detailed. Notes about the habits of neighbors, schedules of local businesses, patterns of traffic, even snippets of conversations overheard in cafes. There were names, of course, the names on the list, alongside symbols I did not recognize at first, geometric shapes and lines connecting one observation to another. It was a surveillance log, meticulously maintained, yet dispassionate in tone, as though recording life had become an art of abstraction. I spent hours poring over it, comparing entries with my own observations. The coincidences were eerie, subtle alignments between entries in the notebook and the people's disappearances I had begun to mapping. The apartment itself seemed like a living archive, holding secrets that could explain years of vanished lives. It was during this time that I discovered a second layer of clues, objects hidden in plain sight. A photograph on a shelf that, when rotated slightly, revealed a different image on its back. A calendar whose markings appeared ordinary until I overlaid it with dates of disappearance,
revealing a pattern that suggested intentional timing. Even the bookshelves seemed to participate. Open books pointing to particular passages, highlighted phrases that, when strung together, hinted at locations or dates. I began to wonder if the apartment had been designed this way intentionally. Perhaps the previous tenant knew something that compelled meticulous recording and subtle messaging. Perhaps he had been trying to leave a trail. Or perhaps he had been watching the same patterns I was beginning to see, only to disappear before completing the puzzle. One afternoon, I found a small collection of envelopes, each containing a single photograph, labeled with a name from the list. They were arranged chronologically according to last known sightings. I spread them across the living room floor and examined them like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. Each image captured a fleeting moment, a glance over a shoulder, a subtle gesture, a shadow at the edge of vision. The people appeared ordinary, yet through the lens of these photographs each carried a sense of impending absence, a foreshadowing I could almost feel in my chest. And then there were the notes, short phrases, cryptic and deliberate. He sees everything. Follow the pattern, the lines intersect, written in the same precise handwriting. They hinted at observation, connection, and hidden intent, but offered no guidance on how to interpret them. I began to transcribe each note, creating a catalog of textual breadcrumbs that I would later cross-reference with dates, locations, and behaviors. By the fourth week, my apartment had transformed. Every surface, every wall, every corner was now part of a sprawling investigation. Maps pinned with strings crisscrossed the walls, notes lay scattered on tables, photographs, ticket stubs, and pressed flowers were organized meticulously. I had become an extension of the apartment's memory, compiling its evidence with obsessive care. But the deeper I delved, the more I felt the apartment watching me. Sometimes I would step back from the wall of notes and maps and noticed objects had shifted slightly, as if someone or something had intervened. A photograph rotated, a note moved an inch to the left. My pulse would quicken. No one had access, I told myself. No one could enter. And yet the subtle shifts suggested an awareness, a presence beyond my own. It was during one of these moments, while examining a photograph pinned near the window, that I discovered the most compelling clue yet. A faint, almost invisible mark on the edge of the image. I traced it carefully and realized it matched a symbol I had seen in the notebook. Cross-referencing it with my wall maps, it indicated a location I had not yet visited. A narrow alley near one of the parks where two of the missing had last been seen. I knew I had to go there. The apartment had provided the first tangible lead. It was a clue that could not be ignored. My heart raced with anticipation and fear. The apartment had been a silent guide, offering subtle signs for those willing to notice, and now I was compelled to follow it. Before leaving, I carefully cataloged everything. Photographs, notes, and objects were secured in folders and boxes, as if preparing evidence for someone else to find. I couldn't help but feel the weight of responsibility. Every observation, every discovery felt monumental, as though my actions could influence outcomes I didn't yet understand. That night, lying in bed, I reviewed the clues once more. The apartment was quiet, too quiet. Shadows pooled in corners and the soft tapping I had begun to hear again, sometimes the radiator, sometimes elsewhere, echoed faintly in the walls. Sleep eluded me. The apartment was alive with secrets, and I was now part of its narrative. I realized then that my investigation was no longer passive. The apartment had transformed from a residence to a participant, offering guidance, tests, and warnings. Every object, every subtle alteration, every hidden photograph or note was a thread leading toward a larger truth. And somewhere along that thread, I sensed, was the answer to the disappearances, the identity of the orchestrator, and perhaps the fate of the previous tenant. The next morning, I stepped into the city with the photograph and the symbol, feeling a sense of both dread and exhilaration. The apartment had whispered its first clue, and now the outside world awaited. Somewhere in the tangled web of streets, parks, and alleys lay the next thread, and I would follow it wherever it led. Chapter 5. Whispers Between Walls. By the time I decided to speak with neighbors and acquaintances of the missing, I had amassed enough clues from the apartment to feel almost like a detective, or perhaps a witness, piecing together events I had no right to reconstruct. The list, the photographs, the notes, they all pointed outward toward people who might have glimpsed fragments of the story. If I wanted answers, I had to leave the apartment and enter their world. My first visit was to Mr. Caldwell's neighbor, Mrs. Hawthorne, whose cautious, measuring gaze had unnerved me before. I knocked gently, rehearsing a casual explanation for my presence. She answered. Knitting needles paused mid-air. Her eyes flicked to the photograph I held, then quickly away. I'm trying to understand, I began, uncertain, about the previous tenant, the list he left. Did you notice anything unusual? Her lips pressed together, her hands tightening on the yarn. Unusual? There's always something unusual if you're looking, she said softly. But there were things. I don't like to say too much. Strange people come and go, odd notes slipped under doors, and the tenant? Quiet. Too quiet. You don't want to pry too deep. Some stories are better left alone. I pressed gently. I understand, but maybe you remember small things, gestures, movements, things that seemed insignificant at the time. Her eyes darkened, a shiver passing over her features. There was a man, she whispered finally. Tall, quiet, observing. Not everyone noticed, but I did. He came by at odd hours, sometimes just standing in the hallway. I thought it was odd, but didn't ask. I wish I had. I thanked her and left with a sense of unease. The notion of observation, silent, omnipresent, was recurring, seeping into the patterns I had begun to see. And it wasn't just Mrs. Hawthorne who remembered such moments. Others I approached seemed to recall fleeting glimpses, a figure standing too still, a shadow passing at the wrong moment, a conversation cut short. At the small cafe near the park, I asked a barista about a woman on the list. He hesitated, then leaned closer. I remember her. She came here once, maybe twice a week. Always seemed nervous. She'd glance at the door a lot, like she expected someone or something. His gaze flicked around the cafe, as if the walls themselves might overhear. I never saw anyone, but she didn't seem alone, even when she was. I took meticulous notes, cataloging each story, cross-referencing names, times, and locations. Some details conflicted. One neighbor said a missing man had been outgoing and cheerful. Another insisted he was withdrawn and secretive. I realized that perception was as fragile as memory, and that contradictions might hide their own truths. A breakthrough came when I spoke to a former coworker of one of the disappeared. She was hesitant, looking over her shoulder before whispering, "I don't think anyone ever noticed him, the man who watched. He didn't speak much, but he noted everything. My boss thought he was thorough, professional, but he lingered, always observing. People joked he had eyes everywhere. And then they started leaving, one by one." Her words tightened the coil of my suspicion. Observation, documentation, patterns. Someone had been watching, recording, cataloging. The apartment, I realized with a chill, may have been a repository for these observations. The previous tenant had not only left a list, but also maintained an archive of the city's unseen interactions, collecting shadows and fragments as though they were evidence. I visited another neighbor, a retired librarian, whose recollections were more precise than most. She remembered dates, faces, habits. "They left gifts sometimes," she said quietly. "Small things, as if leaving breadcrumbs. You didn't notice them at first, but they were always calculated, careful. I didn't understand why until later. The list, the apartment, it was a guide." It was this notion of a guide that struck me hardest. The previous tenant had been trying to direct attention, perhaps to a truth he could not fully reveal, a pattern that remained hidden without someone to decipher it. And now I was the person standing at the intersection of this hidden map. I began to notice the contradictions as another layer of the puzzle. Some neighbors insisted the previous tenant was harmless, diligent, and polite. Others swore he was peculiar, almost predatory in the subtlety of his observation. The same applied to the missing, cheerful or secretive, cautious or careless. The discrepancies did not confuse me. They suggested the subtlety of perception itself was part of the pattern. One had to look closely, not just at actions, but at reactions, impressions, and what went unspoken. Encounters became more unnerving as I pressed further. One former acquaintance of a missing person glanced at me with suspicion, saying, "You shouldn't be looking so closely. Some things, they aren't meant to be unraveled." There was a pause. "Do you want to find the wrong person?" Her words resonated like a warning. I wasn't just piecing together a puzzle, I was navigating a moral labyrinth. Each observation could implicate or exonerate, but misinterpretation could have consequences I wasn't ready to face. My thoughts circled. How much of this web was true? How much a product of my own obsession and projection? Yet despite the tension, despite the moral uncertainty, there was clarity in the contradictions. The recurring motif of observation, of hidden documentation, tied every anecdote, every recollection, every cryptic warning together. I began to chart these statements alongside the apartment's clues, connecting whispers from neighbors to objects, photographs, and notes I had discovered earlier. The web had grown dense, complex, intricate. Each line, each intersection, each cross-reference brought me closer to an understanding that felt at once exhilarating and terrifying. As I stared at the sprawling network of evidence, a faint tapping began again, this time behind the bookshelf in the corner. Not threatening, but deliberate, measured. I froze, listening, heart hammering. The apartment was alive with memory and guidance, a repository of observation that demanded attention. And somewhere within its layers of hidden evidence, I sensed was the first tangible lead toward understanding the disappearances. The interviews had done more than provide anecdotal evidence. They had confirmed that the web extended beyond the apartment's walls, that observation was continuous, and that human perception itself, fragmented, inconsistent, fallible, was part of the pattern. The apartment and the city were inseparable in this investigation. One could not understand the vanishings without seeing both as components of a single, sprawling system. I finally understood that the missing, the previous tenant, and I were now connected in ways I could not yet fully articulate. We were nodes in a lattice of observation, perception, and consequence. Every word spoken, every gesture recalled, every object hidden in the apartment was part of a dialogue that transcended time and space, demanding interpretation. As I lay in bed that night, cataloging the day's interviews, I realized the investigation had shifted. I was no longer merely observing, I was participating. Every decision, every step, Every deduction carried weight. I had begun to see patterns emerge, not just in data or behavior, but in the very act of observation itself. Threads of intent woven into the ordinary fabric of life. And somewhere in those threads, I sensed the answer.
Chapter 6: Obsessive Analysis. By the start of the 6th week, the apartment no longer felt like a home. It had transformed into a command center, a nerve center, a vault of secrets I both revered and feared. Every surface, every wall, every corner was cluttered with maps, photographs, notes, and scribbles, each representing a thread in the intricate web of disappearances I had spent weeks tracing. I began spending hours at a time hunched over my desk, cross-referencing observations from neighbors with the apartment's hidden clues. A single photograph could occupy me for half a morning, noting posture, shadows, angles, objects in the background. I traced lines between locations on maps, overlaid dates, and scrutinized patterns in behavior. The level of detail became obsessive. If I wasn't careful, I feared I would miss something critical. I started to record myself speaking out loud, narrating each deduction as if someone or something were listening. I described the intersections of time and space, the coincidences that now felt intentional, the subtle alignments of objects in the apartment with locations around the city. My voice echoed in the quiet apartment, a companion to the constant tapping I had begun to hear again, sometimes behind the radiator, sometimes behind a wall panel, always faint, always deliberate. Sleep became secondary. Nights were consumed by analysis. Days blurred into nights, marked only by the occasional walk outside, where I checked locations, revisited sites, and observed passers-by. I began keeping a detailed log of everyone I saw who might be relevant: license plates, attire, gestures, fleeting glances. The city itself became a living dataset, each person a node in a sprawling network I was desperate to decipher. It was during one of these late-night sessions that I noticed something unusual in the photographs I had collected. A small detail repeated in multiple images: a particular object, a lamp post, a statue in the park, something seemingly insignificant yet consistent across several scenes. My pulse quickened as I traced the line of sight from the object to the subjects in the photographs. In some cases, their gaze seemed directed toward it. In others, the shadow of something, or someone, was subtly reflected. I started running simulations in my mind, imagining trajectories, movement patterns, timing sequences. Every anomaly became a potential clue, every coincidence a possible lead. I began keeping spreadsheets to track behaviors: time of day, location, social interaction, environmental factors. My obsession grew to the point that I even mapped the rhythms of the city itself, noting pedestrian flow, traffic patterns, and even the lights of street lamps, trying to identify connections with disappearances. The apartment seemed to respond. Items I had previously overlooked revealed significance. A book left slightly ajar contained a pressed note with a cryptic phrase. A photograph, when rotated under the light of my desk lamp, revealed a detail invisible before: the corner of a street sign in the background. Every discovery deepened my compulsion. I was piecing together not just the past, but a predictive model, trying to anticipate where the next clue or the next disappearance might manifest. But obsession comes at a cost. I noticed changes in myself. My reflection in the mirror seemed tired, my eyes sunken, shadowed by hours spent staring at maps and photographs. I started speaking to myself in fragments,
rehearsing hypotheses out loud, testing ideas that no one else could confirm. And yet the intensity of focus yielded insights I might otherwise have missed. I began to sense patterns in the apartment that felt almost orchestrated. Objects shifted subtly, notes appeared in places I hadn't positioned them. Photographs tilted slightly to reveal previously unseen angles. My rational mind protested, insisting it was my imagination. Yet a deeper, instinctive part of me recognized intentionality. It was as if the apartment itself was a participant in the investigation, nudging me toward discoveries I could not yet comprehend. One night, while cataloging photographs of the missing, I noticed something I had overlooked in my earlier obsessive state. A figure in the background of several images, partially obscured, almost imperceptible. At first, I dismissed it, thinking it a coincidence of shadows or background pedestrians. But as I overlaid images, aligned dates and locations, the pattern became undeniable. This same figure appeared repeatedly near the scenes associated with the missing, always observing, always peripheral, never engaging. I realized with a chill that I had stumbled upon the first potentially solid lead toward the orchestrator of these disappearances, but the realization brought anxiety as well. Observation, patterns, and alignment were not proof. They were circumstantial. Misinterpretation could lead me to the wrong person, and the weight of that responsibility pressed heavily on me. Despite the anxiety, I continued my obsessive work. I developed charts linking the figure to locations, dates, and interactions, noting discrepancies and consistencies. I cross-referenced these with statements from neighbors and former colleagues of the missing. Each piece added complexity, but also clarity. The lattice of connections was growing denser, more defined, yet still tantalizingly incomplete. I began to notice psychological effects I had not anticipated. I felt watched even outside the apartment, hyper-aware of glances, reflections, and shadows. Friends and acquaintances noticed my distraction, my agitation, my tendency to pause mid-sentence to jot something down. And yet the drive to understand the pattern, to uncover the truth, overwhelmed any consideration of rest or relief. In one particularly intense session, I revisited the apartment's notes and photographs, focusing on the figure that now dominated my analysis. I compared subtle gestures, posture, and spatial relationships across images. Slowly, a theory began to form. The figure was not merely an observer, but potentially an orchestrator, someone whose presence aligned with the timing and location of each disappearance. My pulse raced at the possibility. I documented everything meticulously, aware that this could be the moment where observation became accusation. The responsibility was immense. A single mistake, a misinterpretation, could condemn someone innocent, and yet I could not stop. The apartment's silent presence, the tapping in the walls, the alignment of objects and clues, all demanded I press on. By the end of the night, I had compiled a comprehensive model, a web connecting the missing, the previous tenant, and the mysterious figure. Every known interaction, every subtle cue, every photograph and note had been incorporated. I stepped back, exhausted, staring at the walls covered in patterns and strings, and realized that the investigation had consumed me. I was no longer a casual observer. I had become an integral part of the web itself. And somewhere in that complex lattice, I knew, lay the truth. The breakthrough I had been seeking for weeks was within reach. The apartment had guided me this far. Now it was up to me to follow the threads where they led. But deep down, an unease lingered. What if the patterns I had uncovered were misleading? What if the figure I believed responsible was innocent, and the real orchestrator remained hidden. The thought was suffocating, yet compelling. I knew I could not ignore it. The analysis, the obsession, the endless cataloging of observation, it had brought me closer than anyone else to the answer. And yet, it also revealed the danger. One wrong inference, and everything could collapse. As I finally stepped away from the desk, the apartment silent save for the familiar tapping behind a wall panel, I felt the tension settle into my bones. The investigation was no longer merely academic. It was personal. The patterns were emerging, the threads were visible, and the next step, following them into the unknown, was unavoidable.
Chapter 7. The Breakthrough. It was on the evening of the 7th week that the breakthrough finally arrived. I had spent days and nights immersed in obsessive analysis, tracing patterns in the photographs, notes, and recollections I had gathered. The apartment seemed to pulse with expectation, as if it knew I was nearing a critical discovery. The tapping in the walls was more pronounced that night, almost like a countdown, measured and deliberate. I was reviewing a set of photographs that spanned nearly 3 years, each one depicting one of the missing, each taken in a public place where I had already confirmed their presence through prior research. At first, the photographs appeared ordinary, people walking, sitting, or interacting with the environment. But something nagged at me. Subtle consistencies in backgrounds, in shadows, in the placement of objects. I could not shake the feeling that each photograph contained more than a mere image. They were embedded with intentional clues. That evening, I decided to overlay the photographs using a digital editor. It was a painstaking process, aligning streets, benches, lampposts, and trees across time and space. When I completed the first alignment, my breath caught. There, in the periphery of several images, was the same figure I had begun to track weeks earlier. At first, partially obscured, but unmistakable upon closer inspection. The tall man from the apartment's photographs, always observing, never participating. I stared at the screen, heart hammering. The realization was both exhilarating and terrifying. The figure was not a coincidence. He was present at the locations of multiple disappearances, a constant in the background, invisible to casual observers, but evident to someone paying attention, the same kind of attention I had begun to give. I began cross-referencing the figure with the apartment's notes and photographs. A pattern emerged in the timing of his appearances. He seemed to move in accordance with the same rhythm I had detected in the disappearances, the days of the week, the specific locations, the times of day. The precision was unsettling. This was no random observer. This was someone orchestrating movement, carefully monitoring, and possibly influencing outcomes. Excitement surged through me as I realized that the breakthrough was more than a theory. It was tangible. I began tracing addresses connected to the figure, mapping his likely routes, his areas of influence. Some addresses were tied to businesses, others to private residences. Each connection expanded the web, revealing a lattice of influence and proximity that aligned disturbingly well with the missing person's last known locations. I documented everything meticulously, aware that these observations could become evidence. Spreadsheets, maps, timelines, photographs, and annotations were compiled into a single, dense dossier. The more I documented, the more clarity emerged. The figure was central to the network of disappearances, a linchpin in the puzzle that had consumed me for weeks. I knew what I had to do. This was no longer a solitary investigation. The patterns were significant, the evidence substantial enough to involve the authorities.
I contacted the local police department, explaining my findings cautiously, careful not to overstate my own conclusions. I sent photographs, maps, timelines, and notes, highlighting the repeated appearances of the central figure and the correlations with the missing persons. It took several days for the police to respond, in which I felt a restless tension, as if the apartment itself was aware of my impatience. The tapping in the walls grew rhythmic again, punctuating my anxious thoughts. Finally, a detective contacted me, arranging a meeting to discuss my findings. I brought the dossier in its entirety, watching his eyes widen as I walked him through each connection, each pattern, each subtle clue that I had painstakingly documented. Over the next few weeks, the police investigation unfolded. They followed the leads I had provided, conducting surveillance, interviewing additional witnesses, and tracing the figure's movements. The alignment of evidence seemed to confirm my analysis. At one point, I received a call from the detective. They had identified a suspect, someone who fit the patterns I had documented, who had connections, however tenuous, to several of the missing. They assured me that they would proceed with caution, collecting further evidence before making any arrests. Despite my cautious optimism, unease lingered. The breakthrough had brought clarity, yes, but also a sense of weight. I was no longer merely an observer. I had become a participant in a chain of events with real consequences. My conclusions could determine whether an innocent person was implicated or the true orchestrator finally exposed. The moral responsibility pressed on me, heavy and unrelenting. Then, one evening, the police called with the news that they had detained the suspect. According to the detective, the individual had been connected through indirect evidence to several of the disappearances and had made admissions that, while partial, aligned disturbingly well with the broader pattern. On one hand, relief surged through me. My obsessive analysis had contributed to tangible action, a potential resolution to years of uncertainty and fear. Yet the apartment, quiet and still as I returned home that night, seemed to hum with ambiguity. The tapping behind the walls persisted, almost contemplative. As I reviewed the clues one last time before bed, I noticed something I had previously overlooked. A small detail, nearly imperceptible, tucked in the corner of one photograph from the apartment's collection. It did not align with the timeline, the locations, or the suspect now in custody. I traced the anomaly, examining every related note, photograph, and object. The detail suggested an alternative interpretation, one in which the arrested suspect was a convenient approximation of the truth, not the true orchestrator. It was subtle, easily missed, but its implications were profound. The breakthrough that had at once filled me with triumph now cast a shadow of doubt. The apartment's silent tapping seemed almost taunting, as if aware of my uncertainty, my potential mistake, my human fallibility. By morning, I knew that the investigation was far from over. The breakthrough had revealed the path, the threads, and the patterns, but it had also unveiled the peril of misinterpretation. Someone had been caught, perhaps rightly, perhaps mistakenly, but the true orchestrator, the mind behind the vanishings, remained elusive. The apartment, once a silent witness, now felt like a warning. The clues it had revealed had brought me to the edge of understanding, yet the final step, the step toward truth, remained hidden. And I, standing amidst the clutter of photographs, notes, and maps, understood that my next move would determine whether I uncovered the final secret or misled justice entirely. For the first time in weeks, I felt the weight of my obsession in full. The breakthrough had arrived, yes, but it had not ended the mystery. It had only exposed the depth of what I still did not know, the complexity of the patterns, and the possibility that my own conclusions could be tragically flawed. And as I stared at the wall of evidence, the faint tapping resonating behind the walls, I realized the investigation was entering a new phase, one in which certainty was an illusion, observation a double-edged sword, and the ultimate truth still shrouded, waiting for the one detail I had yet to uncover.
Chapter 8. The Police Investigation. Once the police became involved in earnest, the rhythm of the investigation changed entirely. My apartment, once the solitary center of my obsessive analysis, now felt like a staging ground for official procedures. Detectives arrived with notebooks, cameras, and protocols I had never encountered, systematically reviewing my carefully curated maps, photographs, and notes. They moved with a professional efficiency that made my own meticulous record-keeping feel amateurish, yet indispensable. The lead detective, Inspector Rowland, was methodical and precise. When I explained the significance of the recurring figure, the one I had identified across multiple photographs, his brow furrowed in concentration. "If your analysis is correct," he said, "we might be looking at someone extremely careful, deliberate. Someone who has been watching these people for years, leaving minimal evidence. The patterns you've uncovered, they're remarkable, but we need confirmation." I handed over the dossier, careful to organize it exactly as I had in my obsessive compilations: photographs with annotations, maps with lines connecting locations and dates, notes cross-referenced with witness statements. The detectives pored over the material, sometimes murmuring to one another, sometimes marking points of interest. I could feel the apartment itself leaning in, as if observing their inspection, the familiar tapping in the walls rhythmically echoing my own tense heartbeat. Within days, the police began conducting their own fieldwork. They retraced the movements of the figure I had identified, reviewing CCTV footage from the parks, streets, and businesses I had marked. They cross-referenced employment records, residence histories, and public registrations. I accompanied them occasionally, guiding them through the locations and details I had painstakingly recorded. Standing alongside them, I realized the scale of what I had uncovered, the hidden network of observation, the intricate lattice of behaviors, the astonishing precision with which this figure had operated. One of the detectives noted something I had not fully considered. The figure's presence was often unremarkable in isolation, blending seamlessly with the flow of everyday life. Only by connecting disparate observations, photographs, notes, witness accounts, did the full significance emerge. Alone, it seems mundane, but when you see it as a series, it's almost terrifying, he said quietly. As the investigation progressed, new details emerged. Surveillance teams captured images of the figure interacting briefly with environments connected to the disappearances. While not directly incriminating, these interactions aligned perfectly with the patterns I had identified. The police noted that several of the missing had communicated with this individual prior to vanishing, though the nature of the contact remained unclear. In essence, my obsessive analysis had provided a blueprint for official action. During this period, I often returned to my apartment at night, reviewing new evidence alongside the old. The walls seemed alive with expectation, the tapping louder, more insistent. Sometimes in the quiet moments between notes and photographs, I felt a creeping sense of foreboding, that the person now under scrutiny might be only part of the truth, a convenient approximation rather than the orchestrator themselves. The police interviews were extensive. Detectives spoke with former co-workers, neighbors, and acquaintances of both the missing and the suspect. Statements were sometimes contradictory, sometimes clarifying. It became clear that the figure I had traced had multiple overlapping social and professional circles, a careful network designed to blend observation with ordinary interaction. The investigators noted patterns I had overlooked,
and I noted those I had discovered that were not yet appreciated. Together, we were piecing together a mosaic of human behavior that spanned years. The first tangible success came when the police obtained additional evidence linking the suspect to several locations associated with the missing. Financial records, travel itineraries, and subtle patterns of communication suggested a proximity I had hypothesized but could not conclusively prove. My meticulous records, dates, photographs, observations were instrumental in establishing this chain of connections. For the first time, it seemed the investigation might yield concrete results. I accompanied the detectives during the surveillance of the suspect's residence. The tension was almost unbearable. Every creak of the apartment floorboards, every flicker of movement outside, every distant car horn amplified my anticipation. We observed the suspect's routine meticulously, noting patterns that aligned disturbingly well with my previous analysis. It was as if my obsessive mapping of behaviors had not only predicted the suspect's movements, but confirmed them in real time. Then came the arrest. The police moved with careful precision, detaining the individual without incident. The procedural calm, the quiet authority of trained officers stood in contrast to the storm of obsessive thought that had consumed me for weeks. As the suspect was led away, I felt a surge of relief, tempered by a persistent, nagging doubt. Something was still unresolved, a subtle anomaly I could not yet name. During debriefings, the police shared preliminary findings. The suspect had been questioned and, under interrogation, admitted to certain interactions with a few of the missing. But the broader patterns, the multiple appearances across years and locations, remained unexplained. The authorities were confident in their evidence, but acknowledged the possibility that elements of the network or its full orchestration might extend beyond this individual. Back in my apartment, I could not escape the sense of unease. The breakthrough I had delivered, the arrest that followed, seemed to close a chapter, yet the apartment whispered a warning. A note tucked behind a photograph, a detail previously overlooked in my obsessive cataloging, suggested that the suspect's role might be tangential, that the true orchestrator, the figure I had traced across photographs and locations, might still be at large. I spent the night reviewing evidence, retracing connections, and re-examining the apartment's subtle clues. Every object, every photograph, every note pointed toward a larger network, one that had not yet been fully accounted for. The tapping in the walls, rhythmic and insistent, seemed almost deliberate, as if urging me to continue, to look closer, to question assumptions. Sleep became a distant memory. I wandered the apartment, notebook in hand, tracing connections, annotating timelines, cross-referencing statements from the police interviews. Each detail I re-examined revealed additional subtleties: the alignment of shadows in photographs, the slight shifts in objects, the recurring symbols in notes. The investigation was no longer linear. It was a living, breathing network, responsive to attention, observation, and interpretation. By the end of the week, I understood that the investigation, thorough and methodical as it was, had only addressed part of the puzzle. The suspect in custody might have been involved in certain actions, but the broader orchestration, the patterns, the observations, the disappearances remained unresolved. The lattice of evidence pointed toward a mind more careful, more deliberate, and more hidden than anyone had yet confronted. And as I sat amidst the clutter of notes, photographs, and maps, listening to the faint tapping behind the walls, I realized the truth. The police could follow procedures, detain suspects, and collect evidence, but the real story, the hidden network that had persisted across years and locations, might still elude us. The investigation was no longer a matter of collecting clues or documenting disappearances. It had become a test of perception, of intuition, of the willingness to trace subtle patterns that others dismissed. The breakthrough, the arrest, the procedural successes, they were milestones, yes, but they were not the conclusion. Somewhere, hidden in plain sight, the orchestrator remained, watching, waiting, and perhaps even aware of my every move.
Chapter 9. Apparent Resolution. The arrest brought a strange sense of calm to the apartment. The tapping in the walls, so insistent for weeks, faded to a subtle rhythm, almost contemplative. For the first time in months, I could step back and feel the investigation had, in some sense, reached a milestone. The suspect, under questioning and preliminary investigation, had confessed to limited interactions with a few of the missing, and while not an outright confession to the vanishings, it appeared the authorities now had a narrative that tied together enough threads to claim partial resolution. At first, I welcomed the sense of closure. I allowed myself a quiet evening of reflection, scanning the apartment and noting the patterns I had spent weeks cataloging. The photographs, the notes, the overlapping lines of observation, they all now seemed to settle into place, like a puzzle partially completed. The apartment felt lighter, less oppressive. Even the familiar rhythm of the tapping had shifted, less urgent, almost approving. I met with Inspector Rowland to review the case files. The police had compiled a meticulous account of the suspect's movements, interactions, and behavioral patterns. In many ways, it aligned with my own obsessive work, and I could not deny the sense of satisfaction in seeing the investigation crystallized into something concrete. The suspect had been connected indirectly to several disappearances, and while the larger mystery remained unresolved, the police were confident that the suspect's role was significant enough to provide a semblance of accountability. The initial relief was intoxicating. I found myself replaying the weeks of obsessive investigation, imagining the narrative finally complete. The previous tenant, the apartment, the list, the clues, the patterns, all leading to an arrest that promised to restore a sense of justice. My apartment, once a labyrinth of observation, felt almost normal again. Yet the satisfaction was uneasy. Even as the police confirmed the suspect's partial involvement, the web of patterns I had traced in the apartment suggested discrepancies. Certain photographs did not align perfectly with the timeline. Some notes seemed irrelevant or out of place, and a small, recurring symbol in the corners of several images remained unexplained. My instinct, trained by weeks of obsessive analysis, told me something was still amiss. I tried to push the thought aside. The authorities had done their work, and I had provided the breakthrough. Perhaps the lingering doubts were simply the residue of obsession, the natural paranoia of someone who had spent countless hours tracing patterns invisible to everyone. I told myself that closure, even partial, was enough. The next morning, unease returned in full force. While reviewing the photographs one final time before returning the collection to storage, my eyes caught a detail I had overlooked in my initial analysis. A small piece of paper, folded and tucked behind one of the photographs of the missing. It was so subtle that I almost missed it entirely. Carefully, I unfolded it. The note was cryptic, a series of numbers, letters, and symbols that did not appear on any previous document or in the apartment's notebook. At first, it seemed meaningless, but as I cross-referenced it with my extensive timelines, maps, and observation logs, a chilling possibility emerged. The numbers corresponded to dates and locations that did not align with the suspect now in custody. The handwriting, precise and deliberate, matched the previous tenants, not the arrested individuals. I sat back, heart pounding. If this note was genuine, if the patterns it indicated were accurate, then the person I had helped the police detain might have been tangentially involved at most. The true orchestrator, the figure I had traced across photographs and observations, remained at large. Every assumption I had made in constructing the narrative for the authorities suddenly seemed tenuous. My mind raced. Could I have led the police astray? Was it possible that my obsessive analysis, though meticulous and methodical, had been misdirected by the apartment's own cryptic guidance? The thought was suffocating. The moral weight of the investigation pressed down like a physical force. I had been the intermediary, the one bridging the hidden web of clues to official action. And if I had misinterpreted the signs, the consequences could be profound. I spent hours reviewing the evidence again, charting alternative paths, questioning each assumption, and examining every photograph with renewed scrutiny. The apartment seemed alive in response, the faint tapping behind the walls returning, irregular and unpredictable, as though emphasizing uncertainty. Every object I had catalogued, the pressed flowers, ticket stubs, cryptic notes, suddenly felt like part of a riddle still incomplete, a puzzle that demanded deeper attention. That night, I walked through the city alone, retracing locations connected to the notes and photographs. Each street corner, each park bench, each alleyway carried a memory of observation. The streets themselves seemed familiar, yet charged with an underlying tension. The thought that the true orchestrator might be watching, always present yet unseen, gnawed at me. Every passerby could be a node in the network, every shadow a potential observer. Returning home, I realized that the apparent resolution, the arrest, the partial confessions, the police narrative was only a veneer. Beneath it lay an intricate lattice of observation, hidden motives, and unsolved patterns. The breakthrough that had led to action had not fully unveiled the truth. The apartment's subtle clues, the cryptic note, the recurring figure, all suggested a story still incomplete, a mystery still active. I sat amidst the clutter of notes, photographs, and maps, staring at the walls. For weeks, I had obsessively tracked every thread, every detail, every pattern, yet the final piece remained elusive. The arrest, the apparent resolution, had not changed the fundamental truth. The orchestrator, the mind behind the disappearances, might still be free. A new sense of urgency surged within me. The investigation was far from over. The apparent resolution was a stepping stone, a temporary milestone in a far larger, more complex story. Somewhere within the hidden patterns, the cryptic symbols, and the apartment itself lay the final truth, waiting for discovery. And I knew with a clarity sharpened by obsession and fear that I could not stop. Not now. Not when the threads of observation, the lattice of behavior, and the cryptic guidance of the apartment still demanded interpretation. The breakthrough had come. The police had acted, but the mystery, the true orchestration, remained unresolved, waiting in the shadows of the city, hidden in plain sight, and perhaps watching me in return.
Chapter 10. Shadows that Remain. The apartment had grown quiet in the days following the suspect's arrest. Official reports suggested that the investigation was effectively concluded, though the detectives themselves were circumspect in private conversations. To the outside world, the case was closed. To me, it had never been further from resolution. The cryptic note I had discovered, folded behind a photograph, refused to leave my thoughts. Its symbols and numbers hinted at patterns, dates, and locations that the police had overlooked or dismissed. When aligned with the photographs and notes from the apartment, it suggested that the person in custody was not the true orchestrator. That realization had haunted me for nights, and now, staring at the walls cluttered with evidence, it became impossible to ignore. I traced each line, each annotation, and each link again, meticulously recalculating timelines and potential routes. The more I cross-referenced, the more the emerging picture contradicted the official narrative. The lattice of observation, the one I had built obsessively over weeks, indicated a subtle yet undeniable truth. Someone else was still orchestrating, someone whose presence had remained hidden behind the layers of misdirection and peripheral observation. Sleep became impossible. My dreams were invaded by images of shadows lurking in the corners of photographs, figures glimpsed at the edge of vision, and the faint tapping behind the walls, rhythmic and insistent. I awoke each morning to the same unease, my mind spinning with possibilities. The apartment felt alive, almost sentient, whispering hints of hidden truths I could not yet decipher. I began a new round of fieldwork, retracing the steps suggested by the cryptic note. Locations that had seemed irrelevant under the previous investigation now demanded attention. Park benches, side streets, coffee shops, and office lobbies all appeared as nodes in a network only I could perceive. The city itself felt transformed, a living puzzle in which I had to navigate carefully. One evening, I visited a quiet cafe marked on the note. It was an unremarkable place, tucked into a corner of the city, frequented by commuters and students. But as I sat in the back, notebook open, I noticed something I hadn't before: a reflection in the window across from my table. At first, it seemed like nothing, just a passerby. But when I glanced again, the same figure I had tracked in photographs appeared, partially obscured, watching the cafe's patrons with careful precision. My heart raced. It was subtle, fleeting, almost imperceptible yet unmistakable. The figure was real, present, alive. My obsessive analysis had not been mistaken. The orchestrator remained at large, hidden in plain sight, continuing to observe, to manipulate, to remain one step ahead. I returned to the apartment that night, the cryptic note clutched in my hand. My mind raced with possibilities. Could the apartment itself have guided me here, revealing the paths and clues that led to this discovery? Or was I simply reading patterns into coincidence, projecting my obsession onto an indifferent world? The line between interpretation and reality blurred dangerously. As I spread my notes, photographs, and maps across the living room floor, a realization struck me. Every piece of evidence I had gathered, the apartment's hidden clues, the neighbor's observations, my own obsessive analysis, was part of a meta-pattern. The orchestrator had anticipated observation, designed misdirection, and created a system in which every attempt to decipher the truth could be both revealing and misleading. My previous conclusions, the breakthrough, even the arrest, were potentially part of this design. The weight of responsibility pressed on me in a new way. If I misinterpreted this final clue, if I reported it without absolute certainty, I could repeat the same error I feared in Chapter 9, pointing the authorities toward an innocent person, leaving the real orchestrator free. And yet, inaction was equally dangerous. Someone was still moving through the city, unseen but influential, and the cycle of disappearances could continue. I began to examine the apartment's details once more, seeking overlooked connections, hidden messages, anything that could reveal the orchestrator's identity. A photograph of the previous tenant, pinned to the wall, caught my attention. Upon closer inspection, A small, almost imperceptible marking was etched into the corner, an annotation that mirrored the symbols on the cryptic note. My pulse quickened. This was not random. Someone had left deliberate guidance, a breadcrumb pointing toward a truth I was only beginning to perceive. As I followed the thread, the tapping behind the walls began anew, slow, measured, almost deliberate in its rhythm. It was a signal, or perhaps a warning. I had become part of the investigation not merely as observer, but as participant in a psychological interplay orchestrated by the unknown figure. The apartment, the city, the clues, they were a system, a lattice, designed to draw attention, misdirect, and reveal selectively. I felt a sudden chilling clarity. The orchestrator had accounted for my presence, for my obsessive analysis, for the breakthrough that led to the police arrest. The figure was aware, adaptive, calculating. Every step I had taken, every deduction I had made was anticipated and incorporated into the ongoing pattern. And now, as I traced the cryptic symbols and aligned them with my evidence, I understood that the investigation was far from over. A knock at the door startled me. My pulse spiked. I glanced through the peephole. No one was there. Only the faint echo of footsteps receding into the hallway. I opened the door cautiously, and nothing remained. The city outside was quiet, indifferent, yet inside, the apartment felt charged, alive with expectation. I returned to my notes, examining the final connections. The figure's identity remained obscured, yet a single, subtle detail stood out. A sequence of numbers on the cryptic note matched a specific address I had overlooked, an apartment building several blocks from my own, a place I had walked past countless times without thinking, never realizing its significance. I knew then that the investigation had entered a new phase. The breakthrough was real, the police action was legitimate, yet the final truth, the orchestrator's identity, remained hidden. Someone, somewhere, had been orchestrating, observing, guiding, and misleading all at once, and now the responsibility fell entirely on me. As I stared at the cryptic note and the patterns it suggested, a single question burned in my mind, relentless and unyielding. Who really stood behind the disappearances? The apartment was silent, save for the faint tapping behind the walls. It was no longer a sound of warning or guidance, it was a challenge. And somewhere in the city, the orchestrator watched, aware of my realization, ready to continue the game. I leaned back in my chair, exhausted, terrified, and exhilarated all at once. The lattice of observation, the web of disappearances, the cryptic guidance of the apartment, everything pointed toward a truth just beyond reach. And in that moment, I understood. The case was not over. It had never been over. The shadows remained, and they were waiting.